Decoded, The Future of Health, hosted by Dr. Vinod Gaba and Alex Kummerman. Today's special guest is Brian Kennedy, Distinguished Professor of Biochemistry and Physiology at the National University of Singapore and Director of the Center for Healthy Longevity, discussing biological clocks and multiomics.
So it's with great pleasure that we welcome today Dr. Brian Kennedy, who's the Professor of Biochemistry and Physiology at the National University of Singapore and is the Director of Center of Healthy Longevity, which is a leading translational research to delay aging and extending healthspan. Welcome, Brian.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So, Brian, tell us a little bit about what, your personal journey that brought you to this point. You've got a very illustrious career. But what really was the driving force?
Illustrious career is another way of saying I'm an aging researcher. I think that I got into the field for a couple of reasons. One is I was an only child, and I only have two cousins in the whole family, and so but everyone lives forever, and so I had all my parents and grandparents and some of my great grandparents, and I grew up around them and watched them age, and I was curious about how they were aging differently. Some were happy, some were depressed, and what was the difference? And then when I got to graduate school, it struck me that, there was nobody, very few people working on aging compared to the big challenge of the problem. I mean, when you think about it, there's 30% of people get cancer, and there's 1,000 times more money spent on cancer research than aging, but everybody gets aging. Didn't make sense. And I started talking to Lenny Guarente at MIT, and another graduate student and I decided to start studying aging in yeast cells. Single-celled organisms. I don't think we thought at the time that it was going to be relevant to human aging necessarily, but we thought if we could just understand aging in any organism, maybe it's a paradigm to start thinking about the process. At the end of the day, we discovered Sirtuins and the Tor pathway using yeast cells, and it turns out there's an amazing conservation between aging in different organisms, even though they're completely different. So. And that just got me hooked on aging. And the other graduate student became a priest, so I don't know what that says.
All right. Make that of what you will.
Actually, he's still doing research too. He's a priest scientist. You should interview him sometime.
That's a whole separate podcast in itself. We'll get there.
Yeah. So your path in academia is, of course, very well established. But can we deep dive a bit into how do you perceive this huge technological inputs into the research world, and how do you use technology today in your field?
It's fascinating. It used to be the field, was very small. I mean, there were about 200 professors that would meet around the world once in a while and talk about aging, and Nir Barzilai was one of them, but now you see meetings like this, and there are very few of those people. It's a whole new world have entered the longevity field. Big data people, technology people. We're having the first meeting on gerophysics next month in Singapore, where we bring theoretical physicists together with aging researchers to try to model from a physical perspective what aging looks like. So it's great, have all these new ideas. Coders, clinicians are more involved now, investors, and I think that it's only accelerating the discovery process and hopefully the translational process too.
So what you see happening is kind of bridging the different worlds together that are from this more, let's say, sick care approach to a more broader ensemble.
I have a slide. I didn't use it yesterday, but it's like aging at the middle, and it arrows to every disease you can imagine. I've been using that slide for 20 years. I'm sick of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like there are no neurons firing when I'm talking about that slide. It's like hardwired in my brain. And so many of us like this have been trying to get this message out about healthspan and geroscience and longevity medicine. There's been different terms for it over the years, but it's the same general concept. And it's great to see people, especially regulatory bodies, starting to think about it, because we're heading down this path toward health destruction. The healthcare costs are just skyrocketing. The sick care approach is not working. I mean, of course, it works to some extent. If I get sick, I want to be treated. And I appreciate doctors who do that. But we have to couple that with true healthcare. Otherwise, we're going to go broke, and our life quality is going to continue to deteriorate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, your recent work has been a lot around validating these biomarkers of aging.
Yeah.
How close do you feel we are to truly being able to represent the biological aging process and quantifying it, whether it's the clocks, whether it's other modalities?
Well, it's really a revolution, because even in 2010, the NIA, National Institute of Aging in the U.S., was saying the search for biomarkers has been a failure. We have some loose correlations, like high inflammatory factors associated with mortality, but it's very loose. We can't use that for anything really. And then these large data analysis, Steve Horvath and Hannum and a number of other people started analyzing big omics-based data sets and trying to predict a person's age. And that was the beginning of the revolution. Now we have hundreds of clocks. Everybody's making them. Ours are the best, of course, but everybody's making them. And I think that different clocks have value for different purposes. Right now, there's no single clock, and there may never be, that fully captures what aging is. But I think in our clinical studies, we're using a suite of clocks now. And I think together we're getting a really good picture of aging. There's still challenges, with the methylation clocks. When we do it academically, we collect every sample the same way. We freeze them all down. We run the methylation sequencing at the same time on the same machine, and we get really good accordance with the data. But when you're mailing things into a commercial site, everybody's collecting their samples differently. There are different times in the mail. They're run often at different times, and there's still a lot of standardization that has to happen. I'm very optimistic about these clocks and different kinds of clocks. We made a clock based on clinical chemistries that I think is great for hospitals. It's actionable now, but it's still research. And it's funny because this field is interesting. You've got development of interventions, and then you've got development of diagnostics, and we need to figure out it's like keys and locks. We need to figure out which interventions fit into which diagnostics, and when you turn that key, what are the physiologic benefits you get from it? And so we have all these verticals now, interventions, diagnostics, outcomes. We need to connect the verticals horizontally and figure out what's doing what. And I think it's an exciting time.
How are you doing that? I mean, are you using technology for that, or is it just like a step-by-step approach, or what's the process?
I think there's a role for AI in that and prediction, but there's also clinical trials. We're still doing the clinical trials. If we measure many diagnostics and many different outcomes, and for each intervention, we start to learn which people respond to which things. No one is going to respond to everything, even exercise. At some level of exercise, probably everyone will respond. But if I tell everybody to go be a marathon runner, it's not going to help some people. So, we need to know how to personalize these interventions. And I think that a big step in that process is doing the clinical studies and see who responds. And then also we need to learn how to combine the interventions together to get bigger effects. And everybody's trying to figure out how to do that right now. I don't think anybody has I think if anybody is telling you there's one way to do a clinical trial on longevity, and that's the best way, they're either lying to you or they're lying to themselves, because we don't know right now. And I think it's still research.
On the sort of, if I just pick your brains a little bit on the data side of this, the multi-omics approach and all those huge, enormous data sets, we're talking petabytes upon petabytes of data, particularly if you incorporate the genetics. That's already a mammoth, gargantuan task for an AI system to handle. But how can an individual work with that? If your own data set is multi-petabyte, let's say, for example, when you start adding all this historical multi-omic data longitudinally over years, and how do you work with that? And then how do you even secure that? And just to touch on the sensitivity of one data set having so much information about you.
I think that you bring up multiple questions there. One is the concerns an individual might have. I don't particularly have any. Every clinic I go to has some of my data. It's like, I don't worry about it. But a lot of people do, and I understand that. And securing it is a challenge. It's not, we have systems at the university that are designed to do that. And the problem is that the more security you set up, the harder it is to access, the harder it is to do the analysis. So It's kind of a balancing act. I think most individuals can't make much out of their own data. If you give them the raw data, they don't know what to do with it. And I think that the challenge is having an intermediary communicate that information to the individual in a way that they understand it, and also in a way that's accurate. I don't want to see a genetics test that says you have this allele of this gene and that makes you 0.7% higher or 0.7 points higher IQ. This is meaningless. So you need to filter the results for genetics or epigenetics or anything in a way that people can understand, and ideally in a way that is linked to actionable changes in their life, either taking something or changing their lifestyle. Right now, I don't think that's happening at a high level. There's some companies, and I've started a consulting company, so I work with a lot of diagnostic companies and clinics, and some of them I think are close to getting it right. But everybody's, it's funny. Clinics are interesting right now because on the one hand they're doing clinical practice, on the other hand it's still research, and so it's this odd mix of things happening in clinics right now, and I like working with them because there's research that's happening there that I can't do in an academic setting. It's too expensive, or you can't get an approved study for this or that. But we can look at what's happening in these clinics. And I think the biggest problem they have is communication, though. How do we take all this data and communicate it in a way that an individual can understand it and ideally make their own choices about how they want to live their life based on that?
And if we focus in on genomics specifically in that data pool, the fact that Singapore has made great strides in sequencing the population and similar to the UAE. And how do you feel that data set is going to effectively, other than helping plan the healthcare system for the country, actually going to contribute to the next novel molecule that's being discovered in a completely different part of the world, given that data is still so siloed?
De-siloing data is essential, and it's so hard to get access to the data sets you need. And even like UK Biobank, they're very supportive of allowing people to access data, but it still takes a long time. There's legal discussions that have to happen, and your university wants lawyers involved, and everything gets slowed down through this process. I'll tell you with the Singapore data, the one big advantage of Singapore is it has Chinese, Malay, and Indian populations. These are especially Malay and Indian populations, are highly underrepresented in genomic studies around the world. And so there's a huge advantage to the Singapore data. Also, they were the first 10,000 genomes they also did DNA methylation patterns with. So we were able to look at biologic aging in 10,000 Singaporeans, and that hopefully paper will come out soon. We learned a lot of things that you might expect. If you're obese, you're biologically older, things like that. The Chinese population is biologically younger, which is probably associated with socioeconomic status. People of higher socioeconomic status are biologically younger generally, but it could be associated with diet differences. It's interesting. You have three different races living in the same place, in roughly the same environment. We also found that baby boys are already older than baby girls because there's a birth cohort there. So something's happening, during development that's already setting the stage for different rates of aging. So all of that's very interesting. I think that as we get more and more data, it'll help with that personalization. Because say we do a clinical trial with one individual and we know a lot about them and we get one outcome, we can go find, other people in data sets that have the same baseline criteria and try to learn from that kind of an approach, working backwards and forwards from big data and clinical studies. I think there's still a big role for wet lab science, preclinical research, basic science, and clinical science. I think data is augmenting that, but it's not going to replace it anytime soon.
And given that, as an active researcher, the context and the diversity and the richness of that data set is almost directly proportional to what comes out the other end, right?
Yeah.
And would you say it's fair that a call for more sort of federation of this data, where sort of safe, secure sharing across barriers, across boundaries, across nations would truly accelerate the science in the field of longevity and science and medicine?
It's a wonderful idea. big challenge, but I'm totally supportive of that. I think it would really help. And also I want to emphasize the need for longitudinal data. Many of these biologic aging clocks have been built with cross-sectional data. Sometimes like the Haynes study had cross-sectional data, but we did have outcomes like mortality and disease down the road, but we didn't have multiple data collection where we could look at omics over time in the same individuals. I think those kinds of data are even harder to find, but they're crucial to improving on how we measure aging.
Fantastic. Yeah. So the challenges today are really the access to this data to be able to make progress.
That's one of the big challenges, certainly. I mean, look, I'll say another thing that I think would reinforce what Peter Fedichev's research is, and he's with a company called Gero. He looks at big data. I think he's a nuclear physicist from Russia. He decided to do biology. I think that he is probably one of the best thinkers in the field on this subject, and he would argue, and I think there's a pretty good reason behind this, that the interventions we're doing now in humans are likely to square the curve, so we'll extend health span, but we may not have a big impact on maximum lifespan. Of course, if that happens, that's a revolution. It's great. I'm not against that. But a lot of us are interested in whether maximum lifespan can be extended or not as well. I mean, this is arguably maybe the biggest question in biology. Can you stop aging? Can you reverse aging? I don't think anybody has the answers to that right now. Nothing currently happening suggests that's true, but there are also ideas for how that might happen. And we still need the basic science to address those kinds of questions, because the interventions that do that may be completely different than the rapamycins and all the things we've developed in the past. So I'm worried right now because research institutions and governments are heavily translationally focused. That's fine. Private sectors come in a big way. That's great, very translational. But we're starting to ignore the basic science, and the really big questions aren't answered yet. So and who knows where NIH funding is going to go, in the near future. I think we can't forget that academics creates the ideas that lead to translation, and there's a lot of ideas to be created.
What's great about your work that it's and your focus in general is from that lab to lane, and the translational element, as you mentioned, and which sort of, from an investment perspective, what do you see as the main areas of upcoming focus in the longevity space?
Yeah, I think the investors in the longevity space are still trying to get their feet under them. There are a few funds now. We work with some of them. Some of them say that they're a longevity fund, which to them means that, by the way, I don't want to criticize any of these strategies. They're just different strategies right now. Some of them say they're a longevity fund. And so they invest in things that target aging pathways, but then they try to treat disease, because classically biotech companies have to treat a disease or have a disease indication. So they focus on that. That's fine. Other funds focus more on wellness and clinics and senior living. And then you have some funds that are emerging that are saying, we're going to do longevity. So we're going to put money into companies that are really doing longevity and look hard at that. And I like the concept of the third one, but it's the hardest one to monetize. So, we work with all of them. I think the key thing is that the fund needs to have a clear picture of what they really want to achieve, what their goals are. And I also encourage people to, longevity is out of the box. Stay out of the box. If a typical strategy is to bring a number of, hardened pharmaceutical people into a fund, which I think is a good thing, but then they take over and it becomes just a pharmaceutical biotech drug development fund. If your focus is on the longevity prize, keep it focused on that. And so I think that there's challenges, but there are more and more people thinking different ways about investment. The investment money is getting a lot smarter than it used to be in the longevity space. And so it's an exciting time. And I think a number of these companies that have started in the last 5 years are going to be big winners. I don't know which ones. I think nobody does really, but it's the market is so huge that that's what you have to remember. It's not just high risk, it's high reward. So
where are the places do you think right now on the planet are the most active into this third category of longevity research applied to?
Well, I mean, historically, U.S. has been a leader in longevity research because of the National Institute of Aging. It was really the only institute focused on funding this kind of research globally. I mean, there people get grants from Europe and Asia to do this, but there was never an institute focused on it, and that goes all the way back to the 70s in the U.S. And now I think you're seeing the emergence of the rest of the world really focused on aging research. China, I would point out, is doing. I'm in China all the time. I see some really great science happening there now. The top institutions in China are at least comparable to the top institutions in the West.
Can you name a few?
Well, it's the ones Tsinghua, Peking University, Jiaotong University, Shanghai, Fudan. And if there are others, I don't want to leave people out, but there are a number of great universities there. And I really hear young people, they're entrepreneurial, they're thinking creatively. They've managed to, at the top institutions, typically research in Asia was like this. You had one senior guy making decisions for 200 people. They managed to break that now, and young faculty and young postdocs are having ideas. So I'm really encouraged. The government is really funding aging research. I go there. It used to be I never met politicians. I've been going there for 20 years. I had a lab there even for a while. Now I'm with Minister of Civil Affairs. I'm with the Vice Mayor of Shanghai, and they're like really saying, what can we do about our aging population? Our demographics are scary because of one-child policy. Now they have the 64-child policy, but it's not working. People are still not having babies there now, and they're like, how can we keep people healthy longer? And so I think there's a lot of motivation there right now. It's not very translational, but the basic science is really accelerated. And also the population in Asia, they think about longevity, TCM, Ayurveda. Longevity is a significant component to that. Health is a significant component to that medicine, whereas Western medicine is reactive. So the population is already motivated to do longevity stuff. Supplements sell the best in China of anywhere, so, and expensive ones too. So the situation is really set up there to do something big. I also add, I have to put a plug in for Singapore. I think they're really thinking about aging and what they can do about it. And the government there, they do things I like and things I don't like. But what I really like about them is I really believe that government cares about its population. There's another government that I know a lot about that I would not say that about. Also, I think that there's a lot of things happening here in UAE, in Saudi. I think that there's a lot of mindset toward healthy longevity here, Oman as well, and it's really exciting. This place is becoming technological leader, and especially in translation and clinics, and I'm really excited to see that. It's a regular stop on my schedule these days. So.
And I think UAE and Singapore have always shared, a parallel sort of journey in many ways.
Yeah.
The UAE was heavily inspired by Singapore in the earlier days, and it keeps the story goes ping pongs back and forth. And but just shifting gears onto certainly when I have conversations with people about aging and the fact that we're talking as a given that aging is a diagnosis, but it's still controversial in people's hearts. Do they really feel aging is a diagnosis? I mean, when we're in the space and we talk about it and we're doing research in it, for us it's a given. But a lot of people would be very against that concept.
Well, to me, it's like, I don't understand why, 30% of people get cancer and it's a terrible disease, and 100% of people get aging. And, it has to be natural. It doesn't make any sense to me to start with. But I also think it's a little bit of a distracting discussion right now, because if you look at the drugs that are the biggest selling drugs, what do? They treat high cholesterol. They treat high glucose. They treat obesity. These are not diseases. These are risk factors for disease. So I don't care if you want to call aging the biggest risk factor for every disease, fine. As long as we can treat it, I don't care what you call it. And so I think it's almost a semantic argument at this point. And if you get too bogged down in it, it triggers people's emotions, and they're like, oh no, because there are all kinds of reasons that people think aging is fixed in religious reasons, for instance. And so I think, to me, focus on health span. And if you want to call it a risk factor, as long as I can treat it, call it anything you want.
And I suppose also from a practical perspective, just giving aging an ICD code, for example, it allows the incentives to follow, right?
Yeah.
We've been talking about how the incentives have been misaligned in the sort of sick care system translating to the healthcare system. And I think that could be a fundamental part of that transition.
And I don't want to speak in a confusing way. I'm totally supportive of giving ICD codes to aging and having the FDA recognize it as a condition. But I just... it has to happen. And I think the route that we get there, I'm not sure what that is yet, but if it's, like I said, if it's a risk factor, that's fine too.
But I think if people understood that classifying aging as a disease would actually directly help them access treatments to stay healthy and prevent disease, they might be more open to accepting aging as a diagnosis.
Well, you're coming back to the biggest challenge we haven't succeeded at yet, and that's convincing people that aging is a modifiable parameter, and convincing clinicians that aging is a modifiable parameter. The ones that come to these meetings are they're sold. They're sold, but they're not most of the clinicians. And education programs that really reach out to clinicians and tell them, hey, this is a huge opportunity to help your population. And I think those are critical right now. There's no aging in curriculums at medical schools. It's unbelievable. It's the one thing every single person that walks through your door is doing, and we don't teach it at all in medical school. I'm a PhD, so I can criticize it as much as I want.
I thought you in Singapore would have started, that program in the medical school level, but in the UAE we're definitely looking at it very actively.
Andrea Meyer, my collaborator in US, has got starting educational programs. But right now it's starting slow. So first is like 2-week programs and like accelerated programs to teach people about aging. There are programs for high-level executives. There's going to be a master's degree soon, and then ultimately the goal is to get it in the medical curriculum. But the medical schools are very defensive about their curriculums, and so it's a challenge.
I suppose under geriatrics and then gerotherapeutics and bridging that into longevity could be an avenue potentially.
I haven't decided I want to die on that hill, but I think it's critical that we do that.
Fantastic. And so if we needed to give, let's say, the viewers or listeners of this, let's say 1 or 2 key takeaways on their health span and optimizing their health span from your research, from your experience and all the work you've done, whether it's through mTOR and understanding sirtuins or what it might be, what do you think are some core takeaways?
Well, first of all, I think that you have to decide where you are and personally. Do you want to be like, do only things that are validated right now? Or do you want to be on the cutting edge, trying supplements and maybe other things? I really believe that we have made mistake in healthcare by not empowering the individual enough to make their own choices. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think one of them is doctors don't have much time with patients to explain things. We can go on and on about these challenges, but ideally what we want are people that are educated about their health and they're making their own decisions. Like take hormone replacement for men, okay? Supplementing testosterone has advantages and risks, and different people might come down at different levels on those advantages and risks. It might make sense for some individuals and not make sense for others. But there's a study done, and there's a 1.5-fold increased risk of prostate cancer, and so then most doctors say don't do it. I think that again, we need to let individuals make those choices. So I think the first thing I would recommend everybody do, and I know it's not easy, is try to educate yourself on your health. Read about it. Look for podcasts. There are millions of them now. It's a little bit the Wild West. You can go to the wrong ones, but it's generally speaking, there's a lot of information out there about health and aging. Second of all, I think that I get really cautious when people tell you to take 80 pills a day, because I know from our animal studies that things contradict each other, things cancel each other out. Occasionally, 2 things that look fine on their own become toxic together. It don't mix and match. I tell people if they're going to take supplements, take one, go on and off, maybe take 2, but don't take 10, because at least if you're taking 1 or 2, you might notice what's happening to your body. And that's the third point I would make, is pay attention to what's happening. I recently took a supplement that had a big effect on my endurance. And it, if I were taking 10 things, I'd have no way to figure out why that happened. Yeah. But I was taking really 2, and I realized both of them are driving better endurance performance for me.
But on a practical note now, if you had 2 that were serving you well, you bring in a third, do you drop one of the other 2 that worked well for you? I mean, it's on a practical note, that's a bit difficult when people are feeling a positive move.
Yeah. Impact. I think that's a decision. If something's working for you, I would stay with it. If you want to layer on something else, at least you're putting one thing in at a time, and trying to see what happens. And also measure. Yeah. And I know these clocks are not super accurate, but if you're measuring the same thing in yourself over time, you can see trends. Go get your clinical profiles done, go to the doctor, get all these clinical tests. We have a great aging clock just from normal clinical parameters. But even if you don't have that, knowing what's happening to your cholesterol and your inflammatory levels and things like that is telling you, don't just do the intervention side without paying attention to the effect side. And I think that's really important for people. And also, I'm very supportive of what a lot of these clinics are doing. If done the right way, I think stem cells are not that dangerous. I think I work with clinics that do that. I'm curious about the gene therapy. I'm not really ready to advocate that yet, but I think it's extremely promising. And I think people that know the risk they're taking and they're willing to do that, and if the clinic is trying to take safe practice and they're honest about the potential benefits and what we don't know about an intervention, I think it's generally okay. So I like working with these clinics that are, as long as they're transparent, as safe as possible, I think.
So it comes back to the narrative of people taking agency of their own health, educating themselves, helping, using technology and data to help drive them make more empowered decisions. But nothing beats taking that control and effectively either building your own data set, as we've been talking about in previous podcasts. But the idea is you're the driver. It's no longer that one physician or that one doctor you visit.
Yeah, I completely support that. I mean, there's another challenge that comes with how do we democratize and scale this approach, because this is an accessible thing for some people that are educated in this, can know where to look, can get the information, have access to the right clinicians. Exactly. That's a small percentage of the population, but at least we can use that. I make the joke that, billionaires are the new model organism for aging research. At least we can generate data and start to get an idea of what might be working. I think, take mesenchymal stem cells. If we find out that's slowing aging, it costs a lot now, but we can scale it, if we know it works, right? Yeah. So I think that we have another challenge, which is how do we help everybody? And that's a different challenge, but right now, I'm encouraging people that have the agency and ability to go and take charge of their health.
Fantastic. I think that's a great takeaway for people to hit home that, nothing beats you taking the time and the effort and the energy required wherever possible to take agency of your own well-being.
Yeah, and it's kind of fun too to watch what happens.
Yeah, it is.
And you feel the impact, right?
I
think it's experiential. It's not just an academic activity. You feel it, you live it, you move forward.
And I'd add just one more point on that. The relevant to clinics is that what I'm seeing with a lot of different clinics is if your goal of your clinic is to bring people in and tell them in 20 years they're still going to be healthy, that financial model is not likely to work, because people don't care that much about 20 years. They get excited about aging. They come in, they measure everything, but getting them to come back over and over again is a big, big challenge. So I really encourage clinics to try to optimize performance and longevity in the same clinic. We have this whole field of performance science and sports medicine and another field of longevity. They don't talk to each other. But the interventions they talk about are like 80% overlapping. So why aren't we doing these two things together? Because if people feel better now as a result of an intervention, then they're motivated and they get the longevity benefit too. So I think clinics need to refocus on doing things that people perceive in the present as well as the future.
Yeah. We live in a world of dopamine rushes, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you get that little high from something you do, you feel great. You're like, I like this.
I
I'm
like
going to keep
dopamine.
going.
I have no
yeah,
problem
and
with
there's
dopamine.
nothing wrong with it. We're just overdosed, unfortunately, and we get withdrawal if we don't get it. And
Yeah.
that's a bit of a problem in itself, but
Yeah.
that for another day. But with that, I'd want to thank you very much, Brian, for your time. It's been a pleasure having you, and we look forward to the conversation continuing.
Great. It was a fun discussion. I'm happy to do more of it.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.